Would you hold on to a promise if it was the only thing keeping you alive? In September 1921, in Galveston, Texas, a 5-year-old named Sarah Mitchell stood among storm-torn ruins, clutching a rag doll as the coast fell silent. That morning, a choice was made that would save 2 children and bury a secret. Years later, what surfaced from a sealed box beneath an orphanage would rewrite everything the town believed about that day. Stay with me. I'm going to tell you the complete story, a dramatized account inspired by true historical events. Before we begin, if stories that are dramatized from real history help you reflect on courage, family, and the weight of our choices, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. Tell me which city you're watching from. It helps this project reach more people who care about memory and meaning. September 14th, 1921. This photograph shows a 5-year-old girl named Sarah Mitchell clutching a handmade rag doll, standing alone in what used to be her neighborhood in Galveston, Texas. But if you look closely at her eyes, really look, you will see something that no child should ever know. She is not crying. She is not screaming. She is just standing there, holding that doll with a grip so tight that her knuckles are white. And there is a reason for that grip. A reason that will break your heart when you discover what happened in the 6 hours before this photo was taken. This image was discovered in 1987 inside a waterproof box buried beneath the ruins of the old Galveston orphanage, and attached to it was a letter that began with the words, "If you are reading this, then you know what I did, and I pray you understand why." The letter was signed by a woman named Catherine Mitchell, and what she confessed in those pages changed everything we thought we knew about the storm of 1921 and the 47 people who vanished that day without a single body ever being found. But here is what makes this photo impossible to look away from. That doll Sarah is holding? It was not hers. It belonged to her baby sister Emma, who was only 3 years old. And if you stay until the end of this story, you will discover why Sarah was found holding it, why she never spoke another word for 11 years after this photo was taken, and why when she finally did speak, the first thing she said was, "Mama kept her promise." Because Catherine Mitchell made a promise that morning, a promise that would cost her everything. And the storm that hit Galveston that day was not the only thing that destroyed lives. Sometimes the most devastating storms are the choices we make when we have no time left and too many people we love. Sarah Mitchell was not supposed to be in Galveston on September 14th, 1921. She was supposed to be in Houston with her father, safe and far away from the coast. But 3 days earlier, something happened that changed everything. Her mother, Catherine, received a telegram that made her hands shake so badly she dropped the coffee cup she was holding, and the crash woke Sarah from her afternoon nap. The telegram said, "Robert killed in railroad accident. Stop. Body in Houston morgue. Stop. Come immediately." Sarah's father was dead, and Catherine was a 29-year-old widow with 2 little girls and no money to bury her husband. But here is what the telegram did not say, what Catherine would not discover until much later. Robert Mitchell did not die in an accident. He was murdered. And the man who killed him was already on a train heading to Galveston, looking for the one thing Robert died trying to protect. Catherine made a decision that night while her daughters slept. She would take the girls to her sister's house in Galveston, leave them there safe and cared for, then travel alone to Houston to handle Robert's burial and whatever nightmare was waiting for her there. It seemed like the right choice. It seemed like the only choice. She had no idea that in 72 hours, Galveston would face a storm that weather stations never saw coming, and her sister's house would be in the direct path of a wall of water that would rise 15 feet in less than 20 minutes. But someone else knew. Someone else had been watching the sky and reading the signs that everyone else ignored. An old shrimper named Jacob Torres had lived through the great storm of 1900, the one that killed 8,000 people and taught him to read the ocean like a book written in a language only survivors understood. And on the morning of September 12th, When Catherine arrived at her sister Mary's house with Sarah and Emma, Jacob was already boarding up his windows and tying down everything he owned. Mary laughed at him. She called him a crazy old man who saw hurricanes in every cloud. But Jacob looked at Catherine with eyes that had seen too much death, and he said something that Catherine would remember for the rest of her life. "The ocean does not lie, Miss Catherine. When it starts breathing different, you listen. And right now, it is holding its breath." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine, but she pushed it away. She had a dead husband to bury and 2 babies who needed her to be strong. She kissed Sarah and Emma goodbye, promised them she would be back in 2 days, and caught the afternoon train to Houston. As the train pulled away, Sarah pressed her face against her aunt's window and watched her mother disappear, clutching Emma's doll, because her baby sister was crying, and Sarah always knew how to make her feel better. What Catherine did not know, what she could not have known, was that the man who killed her husband was not in Houston at all. He was in Galveston. He was watching Mary's house. And he was waiting for Catherine to leave because what he wanted was not something Catherine carried with her. It was something Robert had hidden, something worth killing for. And Robert had told his killer one thing before he died. "If anything happens to me, my girls will know where to find it." That night, September 12th, the air in Galveston changed. It became thick and heavy, like breathing through wet cloth, and the seagulls that usually screamed and fought over scraps went silent and flew inland. Jacob Torres knocked on every door on his street, begging people to leave, to get to higher ground, to trust him just this once. Most doors stayed closed, but Mary opened hers, and when she saw the fear in Jacob's face, fear from a man who survived the unsurvivable, she made a choice that would save her life and doom her conscience forever. She would take her own 3 children and leave, but Sarah and Emma. Catherine left them in her care, and she could not just abandon them. She would come back for them. She would get her children to safety first, then return. It was only going to take an hour, maybe 2. The storm was not supposed to hit until tomorrow afternoon. She had time. She was sure she had time. But the storm had other plans. At 4:17 a.m. on September 13th, the wind started screaming. Not howling. Screaming. Like something alive and angry. Something that wanted revenge for every wall humans had built to keep it out. Sarah woke up alone in a house that was shaking so hard, she thought it was an earthquake. And when she called for her Aunt Mary, no one answered. She picked up Emma from the crib they shared, grabbed the rag doll, and did what her mother taught her to do when she was scared. She started singing, the lullaby her mother sang every night. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." Her voice small and shaking, barely audible over the wind. Emma stopped crying and looked at her big sister with complete trust, the kind of trust that only exists between children who have nothing else to hold on to except each other. And that is when the water came. Not through the door, not through the windows, through the floor. Rising from below, like the earth itself, was vomiting ocean, cold and black and filled with things that used to be houses, used to be trees, used to be people. Sarah climbed onto the kitchen table, holding Emma and the doll, and watched the water rise inch by inch by inch. And she understood with the clarity that terror brings that no one was coming to save them. But someone was watching. Through a window across the street, through the rain and chaos, a man stood in the second floor of the only brick building on the block. His name was Thomas Hendricks, and he was the man who killed Robert Mitchell. He was watching 2 little girls about to drown, and he had a choice to make. Because what he wanted, what he killed for, was somewhere in that flooding house, and if those girls died, his secret died with them. But if he saved them, he would have to face what he had done. He would have to look into the eyes of the children he orphaned and pretend to be their hero. And Thomas Hendricks discovered in that moment that there are some things even a killer cannot do. He kicked open his door, tied a rope around his waist, and stepped into hell. The water was already 4 feet deep and rising fast when Thomas Hendricks waded into what used to be a street. Every step was a gamble. Beneath the surface, the world had become a graveyard of sharp edges, broken glass, splintered wood, twisted metal, and things he did not want to identify. The current pulled at his legs like hands trying to drag him down, and twice he slipped and went under, the rope around his waist the only thing keeping him from being swept away into the Gulf of Mexico. Sarah saw him coming through the window, a dark shape moving through darker water, and she did not know if he was real or if this was what dying looked like. She held Emma tighter. The kitchen table was floating now, spinning slowly in the current, bumping against walls that groaned and cracked with every wave. The water was up to Sarah's chest. Emma was screaming, and Sarah kept singing, because singing was the only magic she knew, the only spell that kept the monsters away. Thomas smashed through the front door, which was barely holding against the pressure, and the house exhaled like a dying animal. Water rushed in faster, and Thomas had maybe 3 minutes before the whole structure collapsed. He saw the girls on the floating table, saw Sarah's eyes lock onto his, saw something in that 5-year-old's face that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She was not looking at him like a rescuer. She was looking at him like she knew. Like somehow, impossibly, she recognized the man who made her father disappear. He reached for Emma first, the baby, because that is what anyone would do. But Sarah pulled her sister away and shook her head. Her lips were blue from cold and fear, but her voice was clear. Promise you will save us both. Not just her. Both. Promise. Thomas Hendricks had killed a man 3 days ago without hesitation. He had watched that man beg for his life, beg him to think about his little girls, and Thomas had pulled the trigger anyway, because $50,000 in stolen railroad bonds makes a man forget he has a soul. But standing in that flooding house, with a child demanding a promise, he found the one piece of humanity he thought he had drowned years ago. I promise, he said, both of you. I swear. Sarah let him take Emma. He held the baby against his chest with one arm and reached for Sarah with the other, but Sarah was still holding that doll, Emma's doll, and she would not let it go. Thomas shouted at her to drop it, to take his hand, but Sarah shook her head and something shifted in her eyes. She looked at the doll, then at him, and said 4 words that made no sense. Mama said to keep it. There was no time to argue. The table collapsed. Sarah went under. Thomas lunged and caught her by her dress, yanked her up, and she was still holding that damn doll in a death grip. He dragged both girls out of the house just as the roof caved in, and they were in the current now, in the full rage of the storm, and the rope around Thomas's waist was the only thread connecting them to survival. The man holding the other end of that rope was Jacob Torres, the old shrimper who knew storms, and he was pulling with strength that should not have existed in a 68-year-old body. But fear is a powerful muscle, and Jacob had seen enough children die in 1900 to spend the rest of his life trying to balance that ledger. He pulled, and slowly, impossibly, Thomas and the girls emerged from the flood and collapsed on the 2nd floor of the brick building that was one of only 7 structures in that neighborhood to survive. Sarah was unconscious but breathing. Emma was screaming but alive. And Thomas Hendricks sat in the corner, shaking, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. Jacob wrapped the girls in blankets and put them by the small fire he had managed to keep burning. And then he looked at Thomas with eyes that had watched men's souls crack open under pressure. "You killed their daddy," Jacob said. It was not a question. Thomas did not answer. He did not have to. The guilt was written in every line of his face. Jacob was quiet for a long time, listening to the storm tear the world apart outside. Then he said, "You got 2 choices now. You can leave when this storm passes and let these girls grow up wondering why God saved them but took everyone else. Or you can stay and spend the rest of your life making sure Robert Mitchell's daughters survive. It was not a choice. It was a sentence. And Thomas knew it. The storm lasted 18 hours. When it finally passed, 47 people were dead, 200 were missing, and the neighborhood where Sarah and Emma lived was erased like it never existed. Mary never came back. Her body was found 3 days later, tangled in the wreckage of the train bridge, her 3 children beside her. She had made it halfway to higher ground before the water caught them. Catherine received the telegram on September 15th while she was still in Houston arranging Robert's burial. The message was simple. Storm hit Galveston. Stop. Mary's house destroyed. Stop. Sarah and Emma presumed dead. Stop. She was on the next train, but the tracks were damaged, and it took 2 days to reach Galveston. 2 days of not knowing. 2 days of praying to a God she was no longer sure was listening. 2 days of imagining her babies drowning alone while she was too far away to save them. When she finally arrived, Galveston looked like a battlefield. Bodies stacked like firewood waiting to be identified. Survivors wandering through ruins, calling names that would never answer. And Catherine walked through it all, showing Sarah's photo to anyone who would look, describing Emma's red hair and the birthmark on her left shoulder, begging strangers to tell her that her babies were alive. She found them on the 3rd day. Jacob Torres had set up a shelter in the brick building where he had pulled them from the flood, taking care of survivors who had nowhere else to go. When Catherine walked through that door and saw Sarah sitting on a cot, holding Emma and that rag doll, she made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, something more primal than either. Sarah looked at her mother, and for one terrible moment, Catherine saw something in her daughter's eyes that broke her heart. Betrayal. Accusation. Why were you not here? But then Sarah whispered, Mama kept her promise. She came back. And Catherine understood that her daughter had held on because of a promise Catherine made when she left. A promise so simple she barely remembered saying it. I will always come back for you, no matter what. And Sarah had believed it, had made it through hell on the strength of those words, and now Catherine had to live up to them forever. Thomas Hendricks was there too, watching from across the room. Catherine did not know him, had never seen him before, but Jacob introduced him as the man who saved her girls. Catherine tried to thank him, tried to find words big enough for the debt she owed, but Thomas just shook his head and looked away. Jacob pulled Catherine aside and told her a version of the truth, that Thomas had risked his life, that he had kept the girls safe, that he refused to leave them even when the building was flooding. What Jacob did not tell her was why Thomas was there, what he had been looking for, or whose blood was really on his hands. That night, while the girls slept, Catherine noticed something strange. Emma's rag doll, the one Sarah had refused to let go, was heavier than it should be. She examined it carefully, and her hands started shaking. The doll had been restuffed recently, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were $50,000 in railroad bonds. Robert had hidden them there. He had hidden them in his baby daughter's toy because it was the last place anyone would look, and he had died protecting that secret. But now Catherine had a choice to make, because those bonds were stolen. Robert had taken them from the railroad company where he worked, planning to return them after using them as collateral for a loan to pay for his mother's surgery. But someone found out, someone killed him for them, and that someone might still be looking. Catherine looked at Thomas Hendricks sleeping in the corner, watched over by Jacob like a prisoner who had not been sentenced yet, and she made a decision that would change all their lives. She woke Thomas in the middle of the night and showed him the bonds. Watched his face go white, watched him understand that the thing he killed for had been there all along, inches from his hands, protected by the children he had orphaned. I know what you did, Catherine whispered. and you know what you did. So here is what happens now. You have two choices. You can take these bonds and leave, and I will tell the police everything. Or you can stay, and we can all survive this together. Thomas looked at the money that had cost him his soul, cost Robert Mitchell his life, cost two little girls their innocence. And he made the only choice that might save him. He reached for the bonds, and Catherine's heart stopped. But Thomas did not take them. He threw them in the fire. They burned. $50,000 turned to ash in less than a minute. And Thomas said, "If you are asking me to stay, I am staying. But that money, it was never real. The only thing real is what I owe those girls, and I will spend the rest of my life paying it." Catherine nodded. And together they watched Robert Mitchell's secret burn away, taking with it any hope of justice, but maybe, just maybe, buying something more important, a chance at redemption. The photographer who took Sarah's picture was named William Brennan, and he arrived in Galveston on September 16th with the Red Cross relief team. His job was to document the devastation for fundraising purposes, to capture images that would make people in safe places open their wallets and feel like they were helping. He had photographed 3 wars, 2 earthquakes, and the aftermath of the 1900 storm, and he thought he had seen every variation of human suffering that existed. But when he saw Sarah Mitchell standing in the ruins of what used to be her aunt's house, holding that doll with a grip that looked like drowning in reverse, he stopped walking. There was something in the composition that was too perfect, too terrible. A child alone in devastation, clutching the only thing that survived. It was the kind of photo that would run on front pages across America, the kind of image that would raise thousands of dollars and break thousands of hearts. He raised his camera, and Sarah looked directly at him. Not like a child looks at a stranger, like an old woman looks at death. Like she knew exactly what he was doing and why, and she was allowing it because she understood that her pain had currency now, that her survival had value beyond just breathing. She tightened her grip on the doll. William took the photo, and neither of them knew that decades later, someone would find that image and ask the question that mattered. Why was she back at the house? Why was she there alone? And what was she really looking for in those ruins? The truth was complicated, the way truth always is when children are forced to carry adult secrets. 3 days after Thomas burned the bonds, a man came to Jacob's shelter asking questions. He was a railroad detective named Frank Morrison, and he was looking for Robert Mitchell's widow. He wanted to know about the stolen bonds. He wanted to know if Catherine had found anything in her husband's belongings. He wanted to know if there was any chance Robert had hidden them before he died. Catherine told him the truth, mostly. That Robert had been killed before he could tell her anything. That their house in Houston had been searched by police and nothing was found. That she had come to Galveston before the storm and lost everything when her sister's house was destroyed. That if the bonds had ever existed, they were probably at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico now. Frank Morrison nodded, but his eyes said he did not believe her. He was a man who had spent 20 years finding things people tried to hide, and he knew the look of a woman protecting something. He told Catherine he would be staying in Galveston for a few weeks, helping with recovery efforts, keeping his eyes open, just in case something interesting washed ashore. That night, Catherine told Thomas they had a problem. Because even though the bonds were destroyed, even though there was no evidence, Frank Morrison was the kind of man who would dig until he found something. And if he started asking the right questions to the right people, if he found someone who saw Thomas breaking into Robert's house in Houston, if he connected Thomas to Robert's death, it would not matter that the bonds were gone. Thomas would hang. But there was something else Catherine had not told Thomas. Something she discovered in Robert's jacket pocket when she was cleaning his belongings in Houston. A receipt from a bank in New Orleans. For a safety deposit box Robert had rented 3 weeks before he died. Robert had made 2 copies of the bonds. One said he hid in Emma's doll as insurance. The other said he deposited in New Orleans, planning to return them anonymously once his mother's surgery was paid for. He was not a thief. He was a desperate man who made a bad choice and died before he could fix it. And now, Catherine had the key to that safety deposit box, and she had to decide what to do with $50,000 that legally belonged to the railroad, morally belonged to no one, and practically belonged to whoever was brave enough or stupid enough to claim it. Thomas said they should leave it there. Let it rot. They had burned one set of bonds to buy redemption, and touching the second set would just damn them all over again. But Catherine was thinking about her daughters, about Sarah, who had not smiled since the storm, about Emma, who cried every night for her daddy, about the fact that they had nothing left except the clothes on their backs and the kindness of strangers who would eventually run out of kindness. She looked at Thomas and said something that would define the next 20 years of their lives. I am not asking you to steal. I am asking you to help me give my daughters a future. Robert died trying to do the same thing. And maybe the only way to honor him is to finish what he started. It was September 24th, 1921, when Catherine made Sarah go back to the ruins of Mary's house one last time. She told her daughter they needed to see if anything could be salvaged, anything at all. But that was a lie. What Catherine really needed was for William Brennan to take that photograph, to create a record that the Mitchell family had lost everything, that they were victims of the storm with nothing left to hide. She needed that photo as an alibi for what came next. Sarah did not want to go. She did not want to see the place where she almost died, did not want to remember the water and the darkness, and Aunt Mary who never came back. But her mother asked her to be brave one more time. Just one more time, and Sarah was 5 years old, and she still believed that being brave mattered, that good girls who did what their mothers asked would be protected by God or magic, or whatever force kept some people alive while others drowned. So she went back to the ruins. She stood where her aunt's house used to be. She held Emma's doll because her mother told her to, because that doll was important for reasons Sarah did not understand, but accepted on faith. And when the photographer asked her to look at him, she did. She looked at him with eyes that had seen things children should never see. She looked at him like she understood that this moment was not about her, that she was playing a role in a story bigger than herself. She looked at him like she was tired of being 5 years old. And William Brennan captured it all. The devastation, the doll, the impossible stillness of a child who had learned that screaming does not stop the water from rising. He took the photo that would appear in newspapers across America with the caption, Sarah Mitchell, age 5, survivor of Galveston storm, searching for memories in the ruins. What the caption did not say was that while Sarah posed for that photo, Thomas Hendricks was boarding a train to New Orleans with the key to Robert Mitchell's safety deposit box. What it did not say was that Catherine had given him instructions that could send him to prison if anyone found out. What it did not say was that the rag doll Sarah was holding so carefully had already served its purpose, that the real secret was in a bank vault 400 miles away, and that sometimes the best way to hide something is to put it in plain sight, while everyone looks somewhere else. Thomas reached New Orleans on September 26th. He found the bank, presented the key and Robert's death certificate that Catherine had forged, claimed to be Robert's brother settling the estate. The banker barely looked at him. Death and disaster made people sloppy, made paperwork less important than just clearing accounts and moving on. Thomas opened the box. Inside were the bonds, pristine and perfect, worth $50,000 that could buy a house, an education, a future for 2 little girls who deserved better than what life had given them. He stared at them for a long time, thinking about Robert Mitchell begging for his life, thinking about the sound Sarah made when she went under the water, thinking about the fire burning those first bonds, and wondering if redemption could be paid for in installments. He took the bonds, not all of them, just enough, $10,000 worth. Enough to matter, but not enough to trigger a full investigation. Enough to help Catherine and the girls survive, but not enough to make them rich and suspicious. He left the rest, closed the box, and walked out of that bank knowing he was still a thief, still a murderer, but maybe also something else now. Maybe also a man trying to build a life out of the wreckage of the one he destroyed. Back in Galveston, Frank Morrison was asking questions. He had found someone who remembered seeing a man matching Thomas's description near Robert Mitchell's house the day Robert disappeared. He had found a train conductor who remembered a nervous passenger traveling from Houston to Galveston on September 12th. He was building a case, slowly, carefully, the way hunters track wounded animals through the forest. Jacob Torres saw it happening. He saw Morrison watching Thomas, saw the trap being constructed question by question, and Jacob made a decision that surprised everyone, especially himself. He told Morrison that Thomas Hendricks had been in Galveston for 2 weeks before the storm, that he had hired Thomas to help repair his boat, that he could provide witnesses who saw them working together every day. It was a lie, a complete, provable lie. But Morrison had no way to prove it was a lie without calling a 68-year-old storm survivor a liar in front of a whole community that had just lost everything and desperately needed to believe that good people still existed. Morrison looked at Jacob for a long time, and Jacob looked back without blinking. And they both understood what was happening. Jacob was buying Thomas time, buying Catherine and the girls' protection, buying the possibility that maybe justice and mercy could coexist if you squinted hard enough. Morrison left Galveston on October 2nd. The case was officially closed as an unsolved murder, probable robbery, perpetrator unknown. Robert Mitchell was buried in Houston with a headstone that read, "Beloved husband and father, gone too soon." And no one except 3 adults and 2 little girls knew that the man who killed him was helping to raise his daughters. Thomas returned to Galveston with $10,000, converted into smaller bills that could be spent carefully over time without raising suspicion. He gave it all to Catherine, and she looked at him with an expression he could not read. "Is this enough?" he asked. "Does this pay the debt?" Catherine was quiet for a long time, holding money that represented her husband's death, her daughter's future, and the most complicated moral equation she would ever have to solve. Finally, she said, "You can never pay this debt, Thomas. You know that. But you can spend the rest of your life trying. And maybe that is enough. Maybe that is all any of us can do. Try to be better than our worst moment." She took the money. And Thomas understood that he was being given something more valuable than forgiveness. He was being given purpose. Sarah watched all of this from the doorway, holding Emma's hand, holding the doll that had saved their lives and hidden a secret that changed everything. She did not understand the adult conversations, did not know about bonds or banks or the man who killed her father. But she understood that something had shifted, that the adults were building something out of broken pieces, and that she and Emma were the center of it all. That night, Sarah finally let go of the doll. She set it gently on Emma's bed, kissed her sister goodnight, and for the first time since the storm, she slept without nightmares. The doll sat there in the darkness, light as it was always meant to be, its secret finally spent, just a toy again. Just a memory of the day everything changed. November 1921. Catherine, Thomas, and Jacob made a decision that sounded insane but felt inevitable. They would stay in Galveston and rebuild. Not just rebuild buildings, but rebuild lives, starting with the house they would create together out of the ruins and secrets they carried. It was Jacob who found the plot of land, a small piece of property 3 blocks from the waterfront that somehow survived the storm mostly intact. The house that had been there was damaged but salvageable, and the owner had fled Galveston swearing never to return. Jacob bought it for almost nothing using money he had saved over 40 years of shrimping, and he told Catherine and Thomas they would all live there together, 1 old man, 1 widow, one murderer trying to be something else, and two little girls who needed adults to stop failing them. It was not a conventional family. It was something stranger and more necessary than that. It was four people who understood that survival is not the same as living, and that sometimes you have to build a family out of whoever is left standing when the storm passes. Thomas did most of the physical work, repairing walls and replacing floorboards and fixing the roof that leaked every time it rained. He worked from sunrise to sunset, barely speaking, barely eating, like he was trying to sweat out his guilt through manual labor. Catherine watched him sometimes, watched the way he flinched when Sarah came too close, watched the way his hands shook when Emma laughed, and she understood that Thomas was living in his own kind of prison, one built from memory and regret. But she also watched how he made sure Sarah's room had the window with the best light, how he built Emma a step stool so she could reach the kitchen sink, how he never raised his voice or made sudden movements around them, how he was gentle in a way that seemed like penance. Sarah watched him too. She was 6 years old now, old enough to notice things but too young to name them. She noticed that Thomas never looked her mother in the eye. She noticed that he sometimes stood in the doorway of her room at night, just watching, making sure she was breathing. She noticed that he had nightmares too, and that sometimes he said her father's name in his sleep. One day in December, Sarah did something that shocked everyone. She walked up to Thomas while he was working on the porch, put her small hand on his arm and said, "Why are you so sad?" Thomas stopped hammering. He looked at this child whose father he killed, whose life he destroyed and saved in equal measure, and he did not know how to answer. How do you tell a 6-year-old that you are sad because you are a monster trying to learn how to be human again? But Sarah did not wait for an answer. She said, "Mama told me that sometimes people do bad things because they are scared, and then they spend forever trying to fix it." "Are you trying to fix something?" Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. Sarah thought about this for a moment, then said, "Okay, but you should know, I forgive you. I do not know what you did, but whatever it is, I forgive you. Because Emma loves you, and Emma only loves good people." She walked away, leaving Thomas sitting on the porch steps with tears running down his face, understanding that children have a kind of wisdom that adults spend lifetimes trying to relearn. Emma was 3 years old. She did not remember the storm. She did not remember her father. And when she looked at Thomas, she saw only the man who read her stories and made her laugh and kept her safe. Maybe that was all redemption ever was, becoming the person a child believes you are. By spring of 1922, the house was finished, and Catherine had found work as a seamstress, taking in mending from families who were also rebuilding their lives. The money Thomas had taken from the bonds was stretched carefully, used for emergencies and necessities, hidden away for the girls' education. They lived simply, quietly, trying not to draw attention, trying to be invisible in the way that people with secrets always try to be. But Galveston was a small town, and people talked. They talked about the widow who lived with 2 men, about the strange family that did not quite make sense, about the little girls who called neither man daddy but seemed to trust both of them equally. The talk was never mean, exactly, but it was there. A low buzz of curiosity and judgment that Catherine learned to ignore. What people did not talk about, what no one knew, was what happened on March 14, 1922, when a stranger appeared at their door asking for Catherine Mitchell. The man was thin and nervous, wearing a suit that had seen better days, and he introduced himself as Eugene Patterson, a lawyer from New Orleans. Catherine's heart stopped. She thought immediately of the bonds, of the safety deposit box, of all the crimes they thought they had gotten away with. She invited him inside with a smile that felt like glass, and Thomas appeared from the back room with a hammer in his hand that was not quite a threat, but not quite not a threat either. Eugene Patterson seemed not to notice. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a document, and he said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I am here to inform you that your husband Robert had a life insurance policy that he purchased 3 years ago. The railroad company has finally processed the claim, and you are the beneficiary of $5,000. Catherine sat down hard. $5,000. Legal money, clean money, money that came from Robert's foresight, from his love for his family, from the man he was before desperation made him make terrible choices. It felt like a message from beyond the grave, like Robert was still trying to take care of them even now. But there was more. Eugene Patterson pulled out another document, this one older and more delicate, and he said, "I was also Robert's friend, Mrs. Mitchell, and before he died, he gave me a letter to deliver to you if anything ever happened to him. He made me promise to wait until you had received the insurance money, so you would know you and the girls would be taken care of. And then I was to give you this." Catherine opened the letter with shaking hands. It was dated 3 weeks before Robert died, and it was written in his careful, slanted handwriting that she had seen 1,000 times on shopping lists and birthday cards and love notes left on her pillow. The letter said, "My dearest Catherine, if you are reading this, then I failed. I failed to fix my mistake, failed to protect myself, failed to come home to you and our girls. I am so sorry. There are bonds hidden in Emma's doll, $50,000 that I borrowed from the railroad. I planned to return them, I swear I did. I just needed time to save my mother's life, and I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed. But someone found out, and now I am afraid. If I am gone, take the bonds. Use them to give Sarah and Emma the life they deserve. Do not feel guilty. I made this choice. I put us in danger. And if there is any justice in this world, my love for you will be enough to keep you safe, even when I cannot. Tell the girls their daddy loved them more than anything. Tell them I tried. Tell them to be braver than I was. Forever yours, Robert." Catherine finished reading and looked up at Eugene Patterson through tears. She thought about the bonds that burned in Jacob's fireplace, about the ones Thomas took from New Orleans, about all the lies and compromises and impossible choices they had made. And she realized that Robert had given her permission to survive by any means necessary, had understood that sometimes love means breaking rules and carrying guilt so your children do not have to. Eugene Patterson stood to leave, but Catherine stopped him. She asked, "Do you know how Robert died? Really died?" Eugene looked uncomfortable. He said, "The official report says it was a railroad accident. But between you and me, Mrs. Mitchell, Robert came to my office 2 days before he died. He told me someone had figured out about the bonds, someone dangerous. He told me he was going to try to buy them off, give them half to make it go away. He asked me to witness his life insurance policy and hold on to that letter just in case. And 2 days later, he was dead. The police said accident. I said nothing, because I have a family too, and sometimes silence is the only way to keep them safe." Catherine nodded slowly. She understood. She asked one more question. "Did Robert tell you who threatened him? Did he give you a name?" Eugene hesitated, then said, "He told me it was someone from the railroad, someone in accounting who discovered the missing bonds. But he never said a name, and I never asked. Some knowledge is too dangerous to carry." After Eugene left, Catherine showed Thomas the letter. They sat in silence for a long time, both understanding that Robert had known he was going to die, had tried to protect his family even in death, had created a path for them to survive. And Thomas understood that he had not just killed a thief. He had killed a desperate father trying to save his mother and protect his daughters, a man who was probably planning to return the bonds all along. It was knowledge that made everything worse, and somehow also made it bearable, because Thomas finally understood exactly what he had taken from the world. That evening, Catherine gathered Sarah and Emma in the living room. Sarah was 7 now, Emma was 4, and Catherine decided they were old enough to know a version of the truth. Not all of it, not the parts that would give them nightmares or make them hate the man who was helping raise them, but enough to understand who their father was and why he mattered. She told them that their daddy had been brave and kind and imperfect, that he had made mistakes trying to help people he loved, that he had died protecting them. She told them that Thomas was a friend who had saved them from the storm, that Jacob was family now, that the 4 of them and the girls were building something new together because that is what survivors do. They build. Sarah listened carefully, and then she asked the question Catherine was dreading. Did Thomas know Daddy? Catherine looked at Thomas, who had gone very still, and she made a choice. She said, "They met once, briefly, before your daddy died, and Thomas promised him that if anything ever happened, he would make sure you girls were taken care of. He has been keeping that promise ever since." It was not quite a lie. It was a truth that had been sanded down and reshaped until it fit into the story they needed to tell. And Sarah, who was learning that adults do not always tell the whole truth, but sometimes have good reasons, accepted it. Emma, who understood less but trusted more, climbed into Thomas's lap and asked him to read her a story. And Thomas held her carefully, like she was made of glass and redemption, and read her the story of the 3 little pigs who survived the wolf by building their house strong enough to withstand the storm. On June 3, 1922, William Brennan's photograph of Sarah in the ruins was published in a book called America Rebuilds: Stories of Survival from Natural Disasters. The photo took up a full page, and beneath it was Sarah's story, as Catherine had told it to the Red Cross. Orphaned by the storm, saved by kind strangers, being raised by her mother and family friends in Galveston. The photo traveled across America, was used in fundraising campaigns, appeared in school textbooks as an example of resilience and hope. People saw it and felt something, donated money, said prayers, forgot about it, and moved on with their lives. But Sarah never forgot. Every time she saw that photo in later years, she remembered exactly what she was thinking when it was taken. She was thinking about her mother's instructions. Hold the doll, stand still, look sad, but not too sad. Let the man take the picture so people will know we lost everything. She was thinking that she was playing a role in a performance she did not understand but knew was important. She was thinking that being 7 years old meant doing what adults asked even when it did not make sense. She was thinking that the doll in her hands was lighter than it used to be, and she wondered why. Years later, Sarah would understand that she had been part of an elaborate alibi, that her image had been used to construct a narrative of pure victimhood that protected her family from questions they could not answer. And she would have to decide whether she was angry about being used, or grateful that the adults in her life were smart enough to protect her from truths she was not ready to carry. But on that day in September 1921, when William Brennan took the photo, Sarah was just a little girl doing what her mama asked, holding a doll that had already saved her life once, standing in ruins that represented both everything they had lost and everything they were about to become. The shutter clicked. The moment was captured. And Sarah Mitchell became frozen in time as the girl who survived, not knowing yet that survival was just the beginning of the story. 23 years later. August 1944. Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a mirror in a small apartment in Houston, adjusting her Red Cross uniform and trying not to think about the fact that she was now older than her mother had been when the storm hit. She was 28, unmarried by choice, working as a volunteer coordinator for war relief efforts, and she had spent the last 2 years helping families who lost everything learn how to rebuild their lives from nothing. She was good at it. She understood intimately what it felt like to watch your world disappear in a matter of hours, to be a child depending on adults who were barely holding themselves together, to learn that safety is an illusion and survival is a choice you have to make every single day. Emma was 25 now, married to a Navy pilot named James Chen, who was somewhere in the Pacific fighting a war that felt both very far away and too close. Emma lived with constant fear that the telegram would come, that she would become the widow their mother had been, that history would repeat itself in the cruel way history often does. But Emma was also pregnant, 7 months along, and she had asked Sarah to be there when the baby came because their mother Catherine had died 2 years earlier from pneumonia, and Jacob had followed her 6 months later, and the only family Emma had left was Sarah and the man they still called Thomas, even though his real name was something neither of them ever learned. Thomas was 63 now, his hair white, his hands arthritic, still living in the house in Galveston they had all built together. He had never married, never left, never stopped trying to earn forgiveness for a sin that only he and one other person remembered. Sarah visited him every month, and they would sit on the porch he had rebuilt and talk about weather and neighbors and everything except the truth that lived between them like a ghost. Neither wanted to acknowledge. But on this day in August 1944, Thomas called Sarah with a request that surprised her. He asked her to come to Galveston immediately. He said there was something he needed to tell her, something he should have told her years ago, something he could not die without her knowing. Sarah took the train down, feeling a knot of anxiety in her stomach that reminded her uncomfortably of being 7 years old again. When she arrived at the house, Thomas was waiting on the porch, looking older and more tired than she had ever seen him, and beside him was a wooden box she did not recognize. He said, "Sarah, I need to tell you about your father, the real story, not the version your mother told you, but the truth. Because you deserve to know, and because I am dying, and secrets should not outlive the people who carry them." Sarah sat down slowly. She said, "How long do you have?" Thomas smiled sadly. He said, 6 months, maybe less. Cancer. Your mother knew before she died. She made me promise to tell you the truth when the time came, but to wait until you were old enough to understand that people are more complicated than the stories we tell about them. And then Thomas told her everything, about the railroad bonds and Robert's desperate choice, about how Thomas had been hired to recover them, how he had confronted Robert, how in a moment of rage and fear he had pulled the trigger, about how he had come to Galveston looking for the bonds, how he had saved Sarah and Emma from the storm not out of heroism, but out of guilt, how every day since then had been an attempt to become worthy of the forgiveness he could never ask for. Sarah listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, and when Thomas finished, she sat in silence for a long time. Finally, she said, "Did my mother forgive you?" Thomas shook his head. He said, "Your mother was too wise to pretend that forgiveness was simple. She told me once that she could not forgive me for killing Robert, but she could be grateful that I saved you girls, and that maybe those two truths could exist at the same time without one erasing the other. She said I would have to live with the complexity of being both the worst and best thing that ever happened to your family." Sarah thought about this. She thought about the man who had read her stories, who had taught her to ride a bicycle, who had worked 3 jobs to help pay for her education, who had been more of a father than a father in every way, except the one that mattered most. She thought about the 7-year-old girl standing in the ruins holding a doll, and she finally understood what her mother had been doing that day. Her mother had been creating a new story, one where they were victims who deserved help rather than criminals who deserved investigation. Her mother had been protecting them all, building a narrative strong enough to survive scrutiny, teaching Sarah that sometimes love means lying, and that the truth is less important than the family you build with the people who stay. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out something she had been carrying for years. It was the photograph William Brennan had taken in 1921, the image of her standing in the ruins. She had kept it all this time, a reminder of both the worst day of her life and the beginning of everything that came after. She handed it to Thomas. She said, "This photo has been in textbooks and museums and fundraising campaigns for 23 years. Millions of people have seen it, and every single one of them thinks they know what it means. They think it is about loss and resilience and the human spirit. But you and I know it is about something else. It is about the lies we tell to survive, about the secrets we keep to protect the people we love, about the fact that redemption is not a moment, but a lifetime of small choices." She paused, then said, "My father made a bad choice because he was desperate and scared. You made a worse choice for worse reasons. My mother made impossible choices because she had to. And I have spent my whole life making choices about who to be in the shadow of all of yours. So here is my choice now. I choose to believe that people can be more than their worst moment. I choose to believe that you spent 30 years trying to be worthy of the accident of your own mercy. And I choose to forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free of hating you." Thomas started to cry, and Sarah let him, because she understood that these were not tears of relief, but of grief for all the years he had spent in a prison of his own making. After a long time, Thomas opened the wooden box. Inside was something Sarah had not seen in decades. Emma's rag doll, carefully preserved, patched where it had torn, but otherwise unchanged. Thomas said, "Your mother asked me to give this back to you when I told you the truth. She said you would know what it meant and what to do with it." Sarah held the doll carefully, feeling the weight of memory and meaning. She understood now why her mother had made her hold it for the photograph, why it had been so important, why it represented both everything they had lost and everything they had managed to save. She asked Thomas about the bonds, about what happened to the ones he had taken from New Orleans. Thomas told her he had returned them anonymously in 1925, after he and Catherine had saved enough money to feel like they were not stealing the girl's future. He had mailed them back to the railroad with a note that said simply, "From the estate of Robert Mitchell. Debt paid in full." Sarah asked if anyone had ever come looking. Thomas said no. The world had moved on, as the world always does, toward new crises and new scandals, and new reasons to care about something other than $50,000 that disappeared during a storm. Thomas died on February 14, 1945, in his sleep, in the house he had rebuilt. Sarah and Emma were there, along with Emma's newborn daughter Catherine, named after the grandmother she would never meet. They buried Thomas in the Galveston cemetery, next to Catherine and Jacob, under a headstone that said, "Friend, Father, Forgiven." Emma never learned the whole truth. Sarah decided that some stories are too heavy to pass on, that Emma deserved to remember Thomas as the man who saved them and loved them without the burden of knowing what he had done before that. It was a choice Sarah's mother would have approved of, another lie told for love. Sarah kept the photograph and the doll in her apartment in Houston for the rest of her life. When she died in 1989 at the age of 73, her niece Catherine found them carefully wrapped in a box labeled, "For Catherine. When you are old enough to understand." Inside was the photograph, the doll, and a letter Sarah had written explaining everything. The truth about Robert and Thomas, about the storm and the choices, about the complicated mathematics of love and guilt and redemption. She ended the letter with these words, "This photo has traveled the world as a symbol of survival. But that was never what it really meant. It was a prop in a performance designed to protect a family built on secrets and second chances. Your great-grandmother Catherine taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is lie convincingly enough that everyone you love stays safe. Your grandmother Emma taught me that some people deserve to live without knowing all the darkness that came before them. And Thomas, who was both a murderer and a father, taught me that people contain multitudes, and that redemption is real even when forgiveness is complicated. I am giving you this because you are the next generation, and you have a choice to make. You can tell this story or keep it private. you can judge us or try to understand us. You can see this photo as evidence of humanity's resilience or humanity's capacity for moral compromise. All of those interpretations are true. That is what makes us human. But if you do tell this story, tell all of it. The good and the bad, the heroism and the crime, the love and the lies. Because the only thing worse than a complicated truth is a simple lie, and our family has had enough of both. Catherine read the letter 3 times, then put it back in the box with the photo and the doll. She thought about showing it to historians, to museums, to people who study disaster and recovery and human nature. But in the end, she decided that some stories are too personal for public consumption, that her family's secrets had earned their privacy through decades of quiet survival. The photograph remained in Catherine's possession, never displayed, never shared beyond the family. When people asked about it, about the famous image of the girl in the ruins, Catherine would say simply, "That was my great-aunt Sarah. She survived the 1921 Galveston storm. She lived a good life. That is all that matters." And maybe it was. Maybe in the end, survival is enough. Maybe the point of carrying painful stories is not to share them with the world, but to understand them yourself, to metabolize them, to learn from them, and then to let the next generation decide whether the lessons are worth passing on. The doll sits in Catherine's living room now, on a shelf next to photos of 5 generations of women who learned how to rebuild from nothing. When Catherine's daughter asks about it, asks why they keep an old toy from a storm that happened 100 years ago, Catherine tells her, "Because it reminds us that even when everything falls apart, even when we lose what we thought we could not live without, we find a way. We hold on to what matters. We protect the people we love. And we build something new from whatever pieces are left. That is the inheritance, not money or property or fame. Just the knowledge that you can survive things you did not think you would survive. That love is more complicated than storybooks pretend. That families can be built from ruins and secrets, and people trying their hardest to be better than their worst moments." The photograph was never the real story. It was just the moment someone decided to stop, to look, to capture an image of a child who had learned too early that the world is dangerous, and adults do not always save you. And sometimes, you have to save yourself. But what the photograph could not capture was what happened next. The years of rebuilding, the quiet acts of care, the million small choices that add up to a life. The way Thomas made Sarah laugh even when she did not want to. The way Catherine stayed strong even when she wanted a break. The way Emma learned to trust again. The way Sarah forgave what should have been unforgivable because holding on to hate was heavier than letting it go. Those are the real stories. Those are the ones worth remembering. Not because they are simple or inspiring or easy to turn into lessons, but because they are true. And truth is the only thing that survives when everything else gets washed away. And maybe that is enough. Maybe that is all any of us can hope for. To be remembered not for our worst moments or our best ones, but for the whole messy, complicated truth of trying to be human in a world that keeps throwing storms at us and asking us to hold on to whatever we can carry and to keep going even when we do not know where we are going. Sarah Mitchell held a doll in a photograph taken in 1921, and 100 years later, her family still knows why. That is the victory. That is the inheritance. That is what survives when everything else is ruins. And somewhere, in whatever place exists beyond this one, maybe Robert and Catherine and Thomas and Jacob are sitting together, watching the generations they protected continue to build and survive and love each other despite everything. Maybe they are finally at peace, knowing that the story did not end with tragedy, but with the harder, slower work of healing. Or maybe there is no afterlife, and the only immortality we get is the stories our families tell about us when we are gone. The way Catherine's great-great-granddaughter will someday hold that doll and that photograph and try to understand what it all meant. Either way, the storm has passed. The water has receded. And what remains is what always remains. The people who stayed, the choices they made, and the love that was strong enough to build a family from the wreckage of everything they lost. That is the story behind the photograph. Not the one in the caption, but the one that only families know. The one that is too complicated for textbooks and too personal for museums. The one that reminds us that history is not made of monuments and dates, but of people making impossible choices in impossible moments, and then living with those choices for the rest of their lives. And somehow, impossibly, finding grace in the ruins. In the end, this fictional dramatization inspired by true historical events reminds us that survival is not just about living through the storm. It's about learning how to live after it. The story of Sarah Mitchell and her family teaches that redemption can grow even from guilt, and that love, though imperfect, can rebuild what tragedy destroys. Sometimes the most powerful inheritance we leave is not wealth or fame, but the courage to keep rebuilding after everything falls apart. What promises would you keep even when the world collapses around you? What truths would you protect, even if they cost you everything? And when have you chosen forgiveness over vengeance? And what did it change in you? If this story moved you, write the word rebuild in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. Tell me which city you're watching from. And if you want, share a memory or story from your family's past that deserves to be told. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe, like, turn on notifications, and share this video to help keep these human stories alive. And when you're ready, click the end card to continue with the next chapter. Stories that remind us why history still matters today.